All right, all right. It's been a couple, been a couple weeks, exactly a couple weeks. It's nice to be back on. I've been actually having some anxiety of coming back on every time. It's like I'm not putting in the same kind of effort going into each of these outlines. Except for today, I felt pretty passionate. So passionate that I might like restart the weekly uploads again. But I think it's better if I still like pace myself. I'd probably need to figure out what I need to do. So I guess first we'll be going over some life stuff, and then for today's topic, we'll actually be going over transgenderism, just like a broad overview of it, and then we'll also do a reaction segment to some of the, I guess to clarify with some context, we're going to be going over like a Jordan Peterson compilation on the Joe Rogan podcast. We're going to go over some of the points that he made, and then I'll share some thoughts over to what those are, or perhaps maybe I'll agree with them. I don't actually really know. I mean, yes, I do know, but we'll see how the conversation goes and which way I want to present it. But yeah, I've got the whole podcast outline over in the Discord channel. Again, we'll be uploading every 2 weeks. And again, I'll probably start the podcast off with I suppose an update of how things are going in my own life. I figured more people. I kind of thought we'd have more people in here today, but then again, I got like the podcast outline fully completed within the past hour, so it's not very fair to everyone else if I'm coming out late. So in the past 2 weeks, I've been signed on to work at T-Mobile full time come July. I was very surprised at the kind of compensation package that I was given through that, which I know it's pretty taboo to be talking about your salary and shit, but I was not expecting what I was offered. I was like overcompensated by 1.5, about like 1.5, the amount that I was expecting to get. That's how much I was compensated by, which super threw me off, but I was very happy to make the decision to sign with them. So, and what I'll be in charge of is pretty important in terms of like the revenue that is going to be brought into T-Mobile. So I'll be in charge of some pretty hefty stuff, but I'm willing to take on the challenge. It's going to be like a whole new chapter of my life too. Like it's been like 5 years since I've moved out of the parents' place. And then also like came back. So it'll probably be like my first time again moving out. But at least it'll be like local. So, you'll be hard hit with all the different responsibilities needed to upkeep your own place. It's going to be fun. At least I know the basics for most of the stuff, but at least I could do things at night, and I could be, I don't know, I might live by myself. I was thinking I would. And so when I was about to say I don't, I wouldn't mind just like keeping the lights on and shit up until like 3 a.m. But who knows? We'll see if there's opportunities to have like different roommates in there with me, but we shall see. We shall see. Anyways, that is the good news that I have to bear to you guys. Thanks for listening. I suppose we'll just get started on the topic then. And the ground discussion is probably just going to be like a broad overview of transgenderism and what it means to each of us. To me in particular, I request that you guys also answer them for yourselves as well. So what is transgenderism to you? To me, it's not something I particularly care about. The only reason why it has any value to me is because there's some political value in it, as well as some people that I know of also have some affiliation with the practice as well. So some people have decided to change genders, and it's not like any of them are necessarily close to me. I know one of my exes is currently dating someone who is transgender as well. So, but it doesn't really bother me that there's trans people out there in the world. I think you go find what you think is the most meaningful to you. The only problem that I foresee that I kind of agree with, I didn't actually mention this in the outline, and I actually thought about it on my run like 20 minutes ago, and I forgot to put it in there. But there's like a couple situations where like incorporating trans people into the population is actually like a problem in the various activities of what the population or society chooses to hold events over, and having their integration in is like a problem. So first of all, being like, do you allow people who are teenagers or children to decide on the surgery for being like transgender? And I suppose we'll go over that at some different time. And then there's also like another topic of integrating trans people into sports. And I think those are really the only two topics that have any kind of dismissive, well, it's not non-dismissible arguments. I think most of the other arguments that are out there relating to like religion is just like, you believe what you want to believe in the same way, that if you want to believe that trans people are like going to hell, whatever, I can believe that you're going to hell without any other reason. It's like, that's just so looped logic that it's not. I don't know if you can really consider those arguments or even something to worth discussing over, but I at least know the other two have like effects on with, yeah, they have some effects that need like some discussion around, and people are trying to already address those questions as well. So, one other thing that I should be addressing, my throat's dying right now. I guess that run really killed me in my throat. So, yeah, I'm in big trouble. Anyhow, how do you see other people treat transgenderism? So there's some people who are like absolutely hate it, and I think there's also some people who are like accepting of it. I'm using hand quotes here. They're accepting of it, but if it came to like anyone in their own life that that like actually mattered, if the matter became more prevalent in their lives, they wouldn't be for it. I think there's some people who are like that. So imagine like you had like a son or daughter, right? And you're hoping that they would fulfill the role of like a son or like a boy or a girl. You wouldn't want them like changing their identity or their gender just to fit what they want. But unfortunately, I think that's like a pretty common like role that parents want to have for their children. Or at least it's not that like I'm statistically saying that it's common, but rather you can foresee a situation where if someone wants to have like a daughter, they expect that daughter to stay a daughter, So, which is, I don't know if that's necessarily too bad. I think people who want to have like a daughter are looking to provide a specific experience. It's either they're looking to provide a specific experience for them because they know how like a daughter or like a girl should be raised, right? But I mean, nobody goes over to, well, no one has like a child in hopes that they'd be like transgender, you know? Is that really what you wish for with your child? And I think the hesitancy when it comes to like your kids being transgender is more of a not too sure whether or not you can help them along like a transgender journey. I think that's like the uneasiness of being a parent. At least for me anyways. It's like, yeah, I know what it means to be like a guy. And to be honest, like I am a guy with very feminine features or very feminine traits. But that doesn't mean that like I'm any less of a guy, you know? I could still be pretty comfortable with raising a guy to be a guy and have expectations for how their life will play out or what kind of roles that they need to fulfill as a guy. So, as like a transgender person, that'd be pretty hard to like have confidence behind. But yeah, that's how I think other people see like transgenderism. I know there's also people who are just like transgender people all the way, put them in the forefront. Everything that they say is going to be true and it's going to be helpful for them. There's people who just like back the whole idea up and without like any thought in the hopes that like freedom will prevail for all. But some of those decisions that they're backing aren't necessarily something that they're not. It's not that they're like aware, they're not aware of. Actually no, it is they're like not considering different dimensions of which an act or a practice could affect like different parts of society or different populations or different groups. Oh my god. Hold on. Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I can't believe my throat's dying right now. Ugh, I should have ran earlier. That's really what I should have done. All right, next bullet point. Do you interact with transgender people differently than non-transgender cisgender people? I think I've definitely. Well, it's hard for me to name one. I'm gonna state that right now. There's definitely people that I've interacted with that are transgender, and I don't think I've treated them differently than like cisgender people. So I think the fact that I can't really make a distinction to begin with is probably a good sign for me. And that's the way that I want to be treating them anyways. It's like I treat everyone as if they have like some knowledge to give. And so in most cases when I'm interacting with people outside of my own like comfortable group, it's usually when it comes to school or when it comes to work. And so when I'm interacting with those people, there's usually a different focus in mind. And so when you have that focus in mind, the identity of those people don't really matter. So when it comes to work, if I'm working on a specific product and I'm interacting with like a transgender person, usually the interaction is revolving around creating a solution for the company rather than it is with the focus on the teamwork between two people of different identities. We're both there to solve a problem, and that's really what I focus on instead. I think that's how people should be looking at it, and I think that's how they should be looking at discussions altogether. Like if any one of, yeah, if you're in a discussion with anyone, I think you should be taking a look at like the objective context, or rather the objective matter at hand of the discussion. It shouldn't be about whether or not like you're pointing fingers at someone for being transgender and therefore their like ideas don't matter. But rather you should always be like objective of what the topic of the discussion even is. And so that's why like I think if you always have something objective to fall to, then like your biases won't really matter in there, or shouldn't even matter in there. You should try to eliminate your biases as much as you can when you're doing your interactions with people. I mean, firstly, because everyone's different anyways. So what do your biases even say when you're interacting with someone to begin with? Like they could be completely different from what your bias identity or what your biases are trying to conjure up in terms of what their identity is. Like you're trying to speak for their identity before they can even do it themselves. And I don't think that's really useful. And so when I think about like when you're treating people differently based on their like biological makeup or perhaps their gender, I don't think that's the right way to be interacting with people to begin with fundamentally. I think that just leads to discrimination and hate, well, spitefulness in a way that to me seems exhausting, but I guess to some other people, that's what fuels their interactions or their perception of life, which I think is pretty sad. So, to really answer the question, I don't treat people differently. So, what injustices are you passionate about relating to transgender people? Well, everybody who's stupid being like people who are discriminatory against like other groups, that's inclusive of transgender people. I don't think that's like, I see that as an injustice. It's like both an injustice towards yourself if you're hateful towards like a specific group of people, and to the people that, and to the victims of that hate. I think that's an injustice in itself. There are two injustices that need to be taken care of. I think transgender people are people too. Should be given every right to do what they want. But there's also like integration issues that people are trying to face. And I don't think the integration is happening in the right way. So maybe this is like a, yeah, you know what? Maybe this would be like a good segue into the two problems that I listed. And then we'll continue on with like the other two ground discussion points there. But going back to like in sports, in transgender people. So say if you were born a biological man and then you become a transgender woman, but you were like a sports athlete before then. And as a sports athlete, like you were a top 10 like male athlete in X sport. Then you transfer over to the female sport once you do the transition over. And now you're like at the top of the game and no one can touch you. So your top 10 statistic as a male athlete ends up turning over to like the number one spot with a large margin as a female athlete. I don't think like transgender, like they do have like limitations in place in terms of like what your testosterone intake would be, or like testosterone negation surgery, whatever. They do all these things to make it like as equal as can be. I'm using hand quotes here. And I don't think you can have a proper measurement of like testosterone levels plus like the biological growth that this person has had as a male to turn over to a female and then just be able to compete in female competitions. So I think the integration there needs a lot more fine tuning. And I was talking about like a different problem with Jared. I think it was last night. I can't remember the topic in particular. Oh yeah, it was like, so this is gonna be like some gamer talk right here, but so there's two common inputs when it comes to gaming, and it's usually mouse and keyboard, and then there's like controller. And usually with controller FPS games, or rather with FPS games in general, controller get like an advantage of having like aim assist, but there's usually some negative aspect that comes along with the controller to mouse and keyboard. But usually like aim assist for mouse and keyboard players is considered like a cheating a cheating advantage, because I mean, as much as they have the freedom reign of aim with mouse and keyboard, with the speed of how you control the cursor, doesn't mean that you get like any sort of aim assist when it comes to tracking people in certain games. So there's different kinds of aims involved with FPS, and some are more advantageous with the aim assist on a controller than it is with the mouse and keyboard. So anyways, we were talking about like those discrepancies and perhaps like what's the best way to integrate both kinds of inputs together. And we came up with a solution of how about you just separate the inputs, and then he made the discussion, or he made the point that seems more of a quitter's attitude, like you're running away from the problem than it is like engaging the problem. So like that solution of itself of like separating everything together is the best way to, is like isn't it shouldn't be considered an option because you're not humoring like both sides in the way that they should be humored. Or perhaps it's too different of a solution that you're not willing to take that risk yet. There's like other alternatives before you lead up to that kind of solution. And so what I was about to suggest with transgenderism is that, and like integrating them into sports, you don't have them competing with each other. Like they have their own category, or you do it based on their biological sex. And then you could say, well, that's just unfair in the way that you want to in the way that you want to compete. But I think it's also unfair that like these transgender athletes also have to go through a process in order to compete in the way that they want to compete. So, for example, if you're transitioning from a biological male to a transgender female, you have to go through all this treatment, testosterone treatment. And who's to say that you want to be a biological, or that you want to be a transgender female with all those treatments in place? Like, why can't you compete with just, doing the surgery exchange, or perhaps just even changing your pronoun? Why do you have to go through all these different hoops in order to be able to compete at these events? And so I think even the current implementation isn't helpful for it's like unfair to female athletes, and it's also unfair to transgender athletes as well, in whichever direction that they want to be going. I don't think it's helpful for either side, and the ways that they want to like compete, or in the ways that they want to pursue athletics as like a profession, right? Because yeah, I don't know. I've already said what I needed to say. It's just there's an injustice towards like transgender athletes, and it's like also towards females. And I'm sure there's like some other dimensions that disfavor males as well in the sports category. All right. So that's one of them. And then the other one was being transitioning as like a child and like a teenager. So when you're at either stage, there's been a lot of talk about like not, especially from like a parent's perspective, is how do you help someone who really believes that they should be in like the opposite sex, or like should be the opposite gender. And to me, I suppose the question is I guess the process of which I would go about that is figuring out like what alternatives there are, or perhaps figuring out like if this really is the case. But there's so many people out there who who, when they're met with the argument of we should wait it out to figure out like what they even like, what a child or a teenager even wants, so many people will come back with the argument saying, well, letting them suffer isn't the right solution either. And I agree with that. But I think also pursuing with a very risky surgery, it's not that it's risky, but rather there's risks associated with the pretty popular solutions right now. So when you're considering those as like an option for a problem that we don't even know is necessarily like a gender dysphoria, or if they really should like pursue like a gender transformation or become like transgender, then it's hard to make decisions like that, especially for like a kid or for a teenager. And I don't think there's really any better way to go about that. There's so many people that will have differing opinions on there that won't be completely countered in the way that they should be countered by either side. I think it's a very complex problem, and I think it'd be very hard for anyone to make that decision for like a kid or a teenager. And I don't think the kid or the teenager can make that decision for themselves. I think there's evidence suggesting that they can't, and there's other people who will say that they can. And for me in particular, I'm leaning on the side of they can't. And that's not to say that I don't want the best for them, because I definitely do. But I don't think the surgery should be a default option for these people, considering the risks. So, yeah, I think it's tragic of what they go through, but there needs to be a lot more. There needs to be some reassurance that, I don't know, there needs to be reassurance that the solution, the proposed solution, is the correct one. Especially when it's like, it's not that it's irreversible, but it's like irreversible because there's, I think, permanent effects that come along with a transition. And so, like, that's a very huge risk when you're thinking on a permanent scale. Some person, yeah, you know what? We're gonna drop it from there. I was gonna bring up like some tangent argument that someone brought up to me about transgenderism. I'm not gonna say it. Anyways, moving on. Have you considered being transgender? No. I do consider myself very feminine, though. You know, even in terms of love language, which, you know, shit on it as you will, I will say that, like, love language wise, I think I align more with, like, what a woman would be interested in. Conventional woman would be interested in more than a guy would. You know how, like, guys are all up in, like, the physical touch and gift, is it, like, I forget, like, the second one. Was it, like, physical touch and receiving gifts? It's, like, the usual. I'm, like, the complete other three from those two. So, and I'm, like, on the extreme level of the other three, other than those two. Like, those two aren't even on the scale. Like, that's how much I'm on the other three side. So, I'm also pretty quiet as well. Like, I'm pretty agreeable. There's just, like, a lot of feminine traits with my kind of character makeup, but I've never considered, like, being transgender. I think I've made peace with the idea that I'm very feminine in, like, a male body. And that's not to say that I can't be, like, a man either. Like, I think I'm very comfortable with being a man with, like, the kind of identity or the kind of values and behaviors that I exhibit. Oh, bless me. Biological makeup versus gender. I don't know what I made. Why did I do that? I might just skip that point for now and just move on to the main part of the main show of today's episode today. All right, so there's the Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan podcast. I have the segment listed on the outline itself. I should actually add most of this over to the YouTube description, and maybe I will, or maybe just like the descriptions in general. Excuse me, not just YouTube. This podcast is everywhere. I keep forgetting, but I do like a specific upload to YouTube as well. So I'll probably just add that to the podcast description for today. But yeah, there's a video that has like a compilation of Jordan Peterson's perspectives over like the transgender crew, and something that, well, I guess I'll introduce them pretty quick. So Jordan Peterson's a clinical psychologist. He's pretty controversial if you haven't heard of him before, but a lot of people who are a part of like the transgender crowd are not a huge fan of him, for some past political controversies that he's had. So like in Canada, they had like I'm gonna misspeak on like what the Bill C-16 thing is, so I'm not gonna say it. Just know that there's like some association with that and Jordan Peterson. Other than that, I really appreciate his work. I think he's a very interesting character and inspiring in the sense that he's made up his, like, I'm happy that he's been able to find his identity, and it's not that I should even be happy about it. It's that I'm inspired. I think he's been the inspiration for how I've grown my own identity, and so I see him as a continuing inspiration as he goes around and talks about like mental health and self improvement from a clinical psychologist point of view. And so he's one of the first people that I would recommend to anyone if they were looking for like self improvement work. But also knowing that he is controversial on a political level is should be like the disclaimer for when I'm giving out that suggestion. Then you have Joe Rogan, very popular podcaster on Spotify. He's had very recent beef with like a lot of social media sources. I think, well, yeah, one of his recent like allegations was that like he was saying the N word on some of his podcasts. Stupid Joe. But I don't know. I see that as like character development. Like he's been a dumb guy. I don't think he was ever generally like a hateful or spiteful racist person. I just think like he said the word many times and he's an idiot. So, internet is forever. He went with the flow with how he normally talked or whatever, or was trying to be like, I don't know, fit in with the crowd, but that really just backfired on him. You should have saw that coming. Anyways, in my eyes, I just think he's a pretty average dude, and he's like everyone else, he's doing the best he can, and he's making an effort to be like better through these discussions with different people. So he's had plenty of people on his show, and it's always refreshing to see like the conversations that he has with those characters or those featured people. So huge fun. I watch him pretty often, not all the time though, depending on like it. Actually, no, just not all the time. I was gonna say it depends on like who shows up, but it's more often that I just don't look at his content, and when he does have someone interesting on, I usually go. So, but yeah, he's a pretty, I would say he's a pretty likable guy, and because he stands up for himself, and that's who I admire. Anyways, so we're going over like this segment content, and this is just like a compilation from some guy who wanted to piece together some transgender points that Jordan Peterson made on that specific episode. So for most of these points, I'm gonna put like a little disclaimer here that this is like all these points are what Jordan Peterson argued, and so within the segment or within the episode. So the first point being socially accepted. So it's socially accepted that like people can accept that someone can be, or like a woman could be born in a man's body. And Jordan Peterson was saying that that's not true. Not like, to some degree, I feel like this point is often missed with like within the public understanding of transgenderism. Like, I may not be able to speak for transgender people at all, but I think it's a pretty bold claim to think that, especially coming from someone who's made peace with who considers himself like mostly a feminine makeup character. I'm still a man, and I don't have like any problems with that. So, have people not considered that before, that you could just be like, mistaking like the own personal assessment of like, you may have more feminine traits as a guy, but does that mean that you should be change your gender over to a girl? Is that what should be happening here? And Jordan Peterson, when he said that statement, was more like making that connection between what people are looking for, or making that connection between people who are mistaking their like I guess like making the conclusion that they were born in the wrong body with that feeling. And so then he also points out like 10% of men are as feminine as a woman is, and like 10% of women are as masculine as a man is. So there's like some overlap between like personalities and how the biological sex that you're coming up with is reflective or can have like a range of different masculine and feminine features or traits. And so you could be even more like feminine than a woman is, or you could be more masculine than a guy. So like as a woman. So I think part of that is just understanding that you could still be at peace with the same gender or with the same biological sex as you are with the gender. You can still have those align and still be okay as like even though you may be like leaning towards like the opposite gender more than you are with your own. But that's not to say that I completely agree that, well, that's not true. I think people should be at peace with their personality and their gender makeup, but shouldn't evaluate themselves on the gender that they are. I think you should still align yourself with like the biological makeup and then figure out your identity the rest of the way from there. If you want to change your gender as like a desire over like a necessity, over like a desire for necessity sake, then I think that's a good way to approach being like a transgender person. But I think if you want to, I think if you see it as more of a necessity, I don't know. I just can't see the same perception, or because I'm lacking the experience as other people do. But I do know what it's like to be someone who may be like aligning more with the opposite gender in terms of like traits. But I'm the one who made peace with still aligning with the biological makeup. Right. Okay. So Jordan Peterson also says that even though like it's socially accepted that people say that like a woman can be born in a man's body, um, doesn't mean that there's evidence for being in the wrong body. Or rather, like the 10% of men are as feminine as a woman is, and 10% of women are as masculine as a man is not evidence that these people were born in the wrong body. This just means that like personalities can flow between one and the other, and there's actually a whole lot of similarities between men and women. So that's the argument like Jordan Peterson makes, and I see life in that way, but I also think there's some other things that aren't. I think this is like obviously taken out of context to some degree, but I think the added information that goes along to that I need to speak for myself is that I don't. You know what? No, on that point in particular, I think that's right. But I think that also doesn't explain 100% of the cases for transgenderism, or perhaps what people like see woman born in a man's body is. Anyhow, I think I I think I murdered that segment pretty badly. Oops. So I'm taking a look at some of the other points that I make in here, some of the other notes that I've made, and I'm trying to figure out like which ones I actually want to talk about. Okay, so there seems to be okay. So there's another point that Jordan makes in the video, which is he ends up connecting like creativity and personality. So with people who are creative, he made those parallels out to people who were playing with their gender. And so on a like when they asked on a survey or whatnot, they took some metric from like a population of people. And so they had like a creativity metrics assessment. And about like 70% of the scores ended up being like 0 across the board. There's like several dimensions of creativity. And so when these people took the assessment, about like 70% scored 0 on everything. And so that would describe what like the demographic of people who are actually creative in some dimension. And so he was making these parallels of, 70% of people wouldn't be creative to be playing with their identity. And so I think a lot of people have this alienation towards like transgender people because they're not creative in the same way that these other people are. And so these people end up being the ones who are changing their identity, which may come off as like pretty foreign to these other people. So he was also making this point that with creative people come like different solutions that their creativity provides or like stems from. And so some people are so creative enough that they benefit themselves, but most of the time it like ends up being a fluke, as with like most creative outlets. So like with paintings and whatnot, you're able to generate a piece of artwork and it doesn't hit like right off the bat or at all. But then you hit like out of 10 paintings, you get one that actually lasts or sticks out. And that's the kind of like hit or miss situation when it comes with creative people. And so what I was drawing with a parallel to that is like how some people have decided that surgery is the correct answer for this transgender feeling, or like feeling like you need to transition your gender from one to another. And so I think some people, the way that I made that connection was that like I now think when people have that problem now, others rely on that same solution because they've seen other people do it. And I think you see that pretty socially, or like in a as like a socially accepted format too. It's like it now is like a social pressure for other people to follow through with these new changes that other people have found success in, that these creative people have found like success in like following. Like how many people would have decided pronoun changes is the correct way to outlet your feeling of respect or needing respect when it comes to your identity? How many of the people who have currently adopted that change would have suggested that change for themselves and for everyone else to adopt? It's hard to say. But someone started doing that, and then everyone else thought that was a good enough idea that they should adopt it themselves. And the same way goes, I think, for people who are suggesting surgery as well. In the same way that people are also suggesting for like teenagers that they need to make the transition earlier than later. Same way that they talk about like people who are transgender in sports. The metrics that they've used for negating like testosterone for male to female athletes has, worked for some subset of people, so much so that it like they decided that was good enough data for them to hold that as a standard. So I think as a whole, I think like the transgender integration will probably get better as more data like comes in, or more instances of these interactions are happening. And I think there's a lot of hope for transgender people in their integration with society in the way that they want to be integrated in, or one that honors their integration in a way that's meaningful to them. So I had some questions to those points, though. And this is more of like a risk factor. So you know how I ended up saying that like surgery was like an answer to some people, and that became like the trend setting and like answer for how you address a certain problem, or when someone addresses a problem, like a transition or like questioning problem. So how do you know when like surgery is the right answer, even though there's a lot of people who are like saying that it is? because it's popular and it's worked for other people? How do you know there's like not different solutions out there that might be better and that might have like less risk associated the the solution? I think you should exhaust like every other alternative before you go for such a high risk solution like the surgery is, or like the testosterone therapy treatment. And the last point that I make in the outline is like, do people ignore the risk based on the popularity of the surgery solution? And I think so. I wish it wasn't like that, because I think the reason why so many people ignore the risk is because it's worked for a lot of people. Like it's not that it doesn't work for everyone. Or rather, okay, it's not that it doesn't work, it's that it doesn't work for everyone is like the risk problem along with that. I think there's a small amount of people who are affected by the transition and want to reverse it. That's not to say that like the majority of people still end up getting help from it. I just don't think like that such a such a it's an investment, it's a permanent affecting investment to have over yourself, over your body. And I wouldn't want anyone to make that decision for themselves without carefully making considerations for alternatives, shallower alternatives, less risky alternatives before they made like a decision like that. Like I'm not it's not that I'm not in favor of using that as a solution. I'd rather have like other steps hit along the way before like a decision like that is made for anyone. Okay. Um you know what? I think I'm going to call it there cuz I'm a little exhausted from the topic. Plus I think I also need to recuperate from how bad like some of these portions were. But anyways, those were my thoughts on transgenderism. Like I don't think people are I really just treat everyone the same in truth. Like there's definitely people who I've interacted with who have different identities and I just don't care. You know, as long as you have a method to staying objective, then I think that's the way you should be looking at all your interactions anyways. I mean, the expense of taking a look at relationships like that is that you don't end up like understanding anyone, or like you're not like respecting them in the way that, so say if people like really care about the identity in the way that I don't, you know, if I'm not through that method, I'm not really respecting their identity at all, if I'm really just paying attention to the objectivity of the work at hand rather than who I'm doing it with. So, but I don't think there's any other way to get by like disrespecting or respecting someone in a way that, you know, that is unfair or discriminatory. If you treat everyone like shit, you treat everyone like shit. If you treat everyone the same way, then it ends up not being a problem. There's no discriminating factor along with your interactions with other people. Anyhow, that's how I hope most people like go into interactions like that. But maybe someone out there will have like a better solution than I do. And I'd be very willing to hear what you guys have to say. Anyhow, I think I'm going to call it there. Thank you guys for listening.